All right, this is my third time back, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to come back here because this is actually one of my favorite conferences, bar none. And yes, I actually run a couple on the side. But yeah, no, I really do enjoy coming here. I am back this year to talk about Zero Trust and trying to dispel a lot of the confusion around it by adding more confusion, no doubt. So, for those of you who may not know me, my name is Dave Lewis. I am Canadian, and I have been doing security now for the better part of 25 years in one form or another, and it has been quite a ride. I've had all sorts of different positions, and along the way, I've done everything from being a firewall admin right through to being a CISO for a power company, and it has been amazing. When I have conversations with folks as I go around the world, they ask me, well, how do you identify yourself? And I said, well, I identify myself as a hacker, but if you have a look around, people don't like us too much. So I think it's really incumbent upon us to actually manage that narrative. And yes, as I said, I am Canadian, and so much so that I actually had to go get this done. Now, this has happened since the last time I was here. I got this tattoo on my arm. If you'll notice, there's a Canadian maple leaf in there. And the reason this happened was about 2 years ago, I was in a hotel lobby in India. And this well-dressed woman walked up to me. She goes, excuse me, are you an American? I said, well, no, I'm from Canada. Why? She goes, good. That was the most disturbing moment of my life. And I went, okay, I've been really big into talking about Zero Trust even before I ever joined Duo Security. And I thought, you know what, I want to have that extra authentication. So Canadians are really easy to identify in our natural habitat. We're dressed like homicidal maniacs going across a sheet of ice. Sorry about your game last night with Finland, but we'll go on with that. At Duo Security, I work as a global security advisor, which means I get to go around and talk to wonderful people like you. And then back in October, this happened. Cisco bought us. At first, I'll be honest, I had fear and trepidation. I had been through many, many acquisitions, but I was always part of the company that was doing the acquiring. And it was very jarring being in a role where I went, okay, am I going to have a job tomorrow? It has turned out to actually be an incredibly good experience, which was amazing. So much so that we're even now on their own website, but that's as vendor-y as I'm going to get right now. The one thing that we did miss as an opportunity with the acquisition was when you had Duo, you had Cisco, you could have been Disco, but that's another thing. Mad props to Wendy Nather, my boss, who came up with that one. So our mission is really simple. It's to protect your mission. So what is Zero Trust? What is the idea? Honestly, when we go back to it, we look at the roots of this have been around for 25, 30 years. Network zone segmentation, user assets, user management rather, asset databases, all of these different components have been here all along. Just somewhere along the line, we sort of got away from that to chase the ooh shiny. And this is a real problem because we have gotten away from dealing with core fundamentals. And honestly, Zero Trust is a wrapper for a lot of these core fundamentals about how we should have been doing security all along. I prefer to use the term trusted access, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but it just seems to be more of a positive. And this was, I gave the, today's 72 hours ago, I gave a talk in Las Vegas, and people said, well, Zero Trust has got such a negative connotation. And I said, yes, but people are paying attention. So there is a positive aspect to it. So then we'll take that Zero Trust and become trusted access. So if I ask everybody in this room, what is love? I can guarantee you I'm going to get a different answer from every single one of you. And this is very much where the conversation around Zero Trust has gotten us to. And so when people ask me, what is Zero Trust? And the root of it is really simple. Everything is on fire. You have to consider the things on the inside of your network as on the outside of your network as being a problem. Because the problems will happen when you least expect it. Now, as security practitioners, we often feel like this guy. Or at least I have for the last 25 years. And it is just a nonstop pain point. So back in 2000, it's actually closer to 2003. I'm still trying to nail down the date. But a group called the Jericho Forum came out with a paper on deperimeterization, which was basically a precursor to Zero Trust. And this was the whole idea of exactly that, looking at network zone segmentation, all the rest of it, locking it right down, making sure you had asset inventories and all the rest of it. And then in 2010, John Kindervag, who was a analyst at Forrester at the time, came up with the term. And you know what? That was great because people started paying attention. And then 2014, Google came out with their own paper where they discussed their implementation called Beyond Corp. And honestly, that was pretty cool. What's even cooler is in about 2017, they came out with a report card, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. And this is amazing. So let's just, before you wonder about zero trust in your own environment, realize it's an incremental discussion, right? You have to go a little bit at a time, because it took Google 7 years to roll out their implementation. So don't feel bad if it's taking you a while. If you want to know more about it after this talk, there's a great book here called Zero Trust Networks. The really interesting thing about this is I know none of the authors and I have no play in this, but this is actually an excellent resource to get into. So the IT landscape is changing in many ways. We have gone from being a perimeter with a castle wall and everything on the inside to cloud implementations everywhere, SaaS-based offerings and all the rest of it. Our employees are mobile. I live on the road. I couldn't even imagine having to go back in the office to get my email because it's like downloading 25,000 emails. It would be really frustrating. You need to be able to work anywhere. We've gone to multiple cloud access platforms, wherever it happens to be. Is your company using Outlook or the Office 365? Are you using Gmail? Whatever it happens to be. Are your companies using BYOD? And the thing is, you want to prevent breaches. It's all about reducing the risk in your environment. So Beyond Corp was their own implementation at Google. So as I was going through, right through to 2017, they came out with a report card on how they were doing. And they were rather transparent with it, which was really amazing because I look at this as an excellent way for people to learn how things went for them. Because we've gone from a traditional approach of having that, network access controls and firewalls, and that was it, right through to where the access decisions are being made. So the perimeter used to be the wall. This is your firewall, that was it. Everything's fine on the inside, which never was. But now the perimeter is really anytime an access decision is being made. Now, we all love our triads, so this is a really simple way to look at it. You have your apps, your devices, and you have your users. When you're looking to do a zero trust type of implementation, I'm not sure if you're taking a picture there or not. Oh, okay. As we're going through it, the easiest way to start is, even below this is having an asset inventory of the devices in your organization. But you want to confirm your user identities. Let's see if my laser works today. Yay! Gain access visibility. So you want to see what your users are trying to do. You want to ensure device security. So you want to make sure you're having the same type of security configuration across all your devices. You want to be able to enforce contextual policies so that you don't have HR being able to access production and dev systems that they don't need to get to, and be able to secure access to all the applications that you use in your environment. And over the years, one of the things that I've really gone, as we go talk about this today, one of the things I look back is that I learned a valuable lesson a long time ago, is castles simply don't scale. When I worked at a power company back in mid-2000s, I had the CIO look at me and say this: we trust everything inside our firewall because we trust everyone who works here. This is such a fractured notion. Just because something is on the inside of your network doesn't mean you should trust it. Now, we all like to think of ourselves as being environmentally conscious, environmentally friendly, but please do not recycle passwords. We have this really bad habit as humans that we will use the same username and password, password 1, password 2, whatever it happens to be, on multiple sites. So if you're using it for your internet banking and your email and your Amazon account or whatever it happens to be, and one of those gets compromised, what the attackers like to do is take those credentials and then use them against other sites to see what else they can gain access to, typically referred to as credential stuffing. Don't make their job easier. If you have to use a static password, use a different one. Use a password manager. There are multiple types of password managers out there. And if you have relatives that are doing this where you know they're using the same username and password, convince them to use a password manager. There's multiple choices out there that you can pick from. My folks are in their 70s. I got them to use a password manager. If I can do it. But the thing is, with a password, that's really a deprecated notion. That's something that isn't as effective as some might think. So if you come forward and you say, here's my password, that does nothing to confirm who you are. Ultimately, as a defender, you want to say, nope, go away, this isn't going to happen. But the reality here is you want to have something better than that. Security paradigms have to shift to a positive state. And I just noticed this up here, and that is really cool. Yes, I'm easily distracted. So before I ever got into computer security at all, I was doing a degree in classical studies and archaeology. Long story on how I got here. But this is one of the really interesting lessons that I've taken from that training was the fall of Rome in 410 AD. Now the Visigoths showed up, they set up shop and locked down access to the city, nothing in or out. Within a period of time, the Romans ran out of food, they ran out of supplies, and they threw open the doors and said, we give up. The attackers were able to use their own security paradigm against them. A perimeter-based model, the old way of having the firewall and the perimeter, was demonstrably proven as a broken security defense in 410 AD. And yet we still see that in a lot of networks today. Now, being Canadian, we have a lot of bears, so one of the analogies we like to use is you always want to be faster than the hiker that's right behind you. Not that I have any experience in that. Black bears apparently can't run that fast, thankfully. Sorry, Bob. But this is the same thing applies with security. You want to make sure you're doing a better job. And as you're going through and doing a better job, you have to realize that what was once a case of you just had to keep away from the one threat, there are now many more threats to deal with. The really funny thing about this particular slide is when I was giving this talk in Bogota, Colombia, there was the military attaché from the Russian embassy sitting up in the front, and he didn't quite like that. Sorry. So the whole idea, when you're looking at it from a trusted access approach, is reducing the risk. You want to make sure you are reducing the risk. You're never going to be to 100%. So dissuade yourself of that notion right now. But you can get to a much better place from a security impact. And the thing is, if the attackers are stymied by the controls that you put in place, they'll go on to try and attack somebody else. So you've done your job to protect your enterprise. Now we want to make sure that we don't turn into this guy. This guy is actually analogous to someone I worked with many, many years ago. And I referred to him as the flaming sword of justice. His entire mantra was, how do we get to know? Anytime there was any sort of indiscretion on the network, he wanted to have the power to fire that individual. It was insane. At one point, I had an early iteration of Twitter open on my desktop, and the web browser was refreshing in the background. And, well, apparently that was a denial of service attack in his eyes. Let that sink in for a second. This is the way old school security really was done in many organizations. This whole flaming sword of justice, getting to know, is not an effective way for us as security practitioners to do our job. We're there to enable the business, but to do it in a safe and secure fashion. Because this is going to keep happening. Data breach after data breach. How many people here, by a show of hands, are familiar with Amazon S3 buckets, or AWS S3 buckets? Yeah, that's the best response I've had yet. Awesome. So the problem here with S3 buckets is by default, I'll say that again, by default, these are not set to public access. Unfortunately, a lot of the data breaches we've seen in the last year have actually had their buckets set to public access. There are multiple scanners that you can find on GitHub that will allow you to iterate through these and looking for resources like this that are freely available. And for those of you who don't know, an S3 bucket is a data repository where you can put image files, data files, whatever it happens to be. And if you make them freely available, bad things are going to happen. Now, these are not S3 related, but Marriott, Quora, Citrix, these are examples that this can happen to anyone. And this is not to throw any aspersions towards these companies, but it just shows that anybody is susceptible to a data breach. Now, with the DBIR report that came out, was it 2 weeks ago now? One of the things that it went through, 81% of the credentials that were involved in data breaches were using weak credentials. We love to blame the user. We need to stop doing that. Because if a user is using a password of 1234 or QWERTY or whatever it happens to be, that's because we haven't either trained them properly on how we expect them to do security, or we haven't given them the tools to do a better job. Multifactor authentication, biometrics, whatever it happens to be, something better than the static password. The perimeters that we have to deal with are porous, to say the very least. We have all sorts of traffic traversing our enterprise, however it is structured, hybrid, cloud, on-prem, whatever it happens to be. And we have to evolve our thinking as to what that perimeter is. Now, this is a quote directly from my boss. Yes. Hello. The perimeter is anywhere an access decision is being made. I used to think that the data was the perimeter, but honestly, I like this a whole lot better because it is really more apt. And our perimeter has changed. We have all sorts of different access coming into our networks. Remote employees, whatever it happens to be. Now, one of my favorite ones was with remote employees. I worked for one power company years ago where we had developers in India that were doing code development for us. And they were doing a fine job and everything, but one day we decided to do an audit of access to the network. In the space of about less than 3 hours or something like that, we had 9 different people log in from different places around India. And they were all using the same key fob. So they were calling in to get the number, somebody to read it to them over the phone, and then they would enter it and off they went. Obviously, this was a problem. And it was not so much a problem with the way they were doing things. The problem was we hadn't told them what we expected. There was no security requirements baked into the contract. At no point did we say, this is good, this is bad. So they were just operating in a way that was effective. You know what? Skunkworks happen because something is missing. With the Zero Trust model, you want to look at dealing with access. How are you managing your users in your environment? That is one of the key pieces. The devices that you're using in your environment. Are you having corporate assets or are you allowing external assets? How are you handling those? And the applications that they're using. Couple of marketing looking slides, but they're not. The whole idea here is you want to be able to give folks the same access that they're using at a coffee shop as they would see in the office, as they would see at home. You want to make that uniform across the board. Because if we don't do a better job of managing how people are accessing things, stuff like this is going to keep happening. Now, on my own website, I started tracking data breaches back in 2012 because apparently I need a hobby. But here, the third row down, LinkedIn, 6.5 million records. At the time, that was huge news. But these days, we're dealing with record breaches in the order of magnitude of 1 billion records. This is absolutely maddening. So why do we keep getting worse? And it's painful, too. And I know how painful it is because I've lived through it. This here is an actual screen grab from a company I was working at where the website was, one of the websites that we had was actually compromised. This was one of those unnerving moments where I came into work, sat down, had my coffee on my desk, and look, and there was a stack of notes there from CBC and all those other publications that wanted to talk to us about a data breach that we had. And I was like, what? Look at my phone, multiple missed calls. Oops. This was a case of we had identified an asset that had to be retired because it was using a deprecated version of WordPress. And we said, look, you need to take that offline. They said, sure, no problem. They didn't take it offline. I didn't blame them. I blamed myself. That was something where I could have gone and followed up to make sure they had taken that down. I could have gotten them to commit to a timeline when they took it down. But I didn't. But I learned from that. Thankfully, it was only a reputational risk in that particular instance, but still painful nonetheless. So I always love pulling out these slides. This is from a site, informationisbeautiful.net. This is a couple of years ago. This is a graphical representation of various data breaches. This is a little bit more recently. In 2 years, that's how bad it's gotten. And then we jump to now, where they have actually taken and re-architected how they present the data because it wouldn't fit anymore. We can do better than this. We are better than this. Which leads me to the question, what's open in Sweden? So I went looking around on everybody's favorite Google for hackers, Showdown. This is how many ports were currently available listening in Sweden at the time that I checked. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all bad by any stretch of the imagination, but law of averages, some of them will be. Even right down to Gothenburg, we have this many ports that we're currently listening. And it's really amazing what people will allow unfettered access to. Somebody's garage, somebody's backyard. I'm not really sure what that is, but somebody had that online. And I don't know if that's a Pigpen or what that is, but all of these are from Sweden. None of these required me to log into the site. I didn't have to hack anything. It was just hanging out there in the breeze. When people are providing access to something as simple as that, and then you extrapolate out as to what other problems could be lying out there. We can do better. So you want to make sure that you're making it harder for the attacker. You want to devalue stolen credentials. So if a site gets compromised and usernames and passwords are dumped out, you don't want it to be easy for the attacker to do their job. You want to make sure the low-hanging fruit go away. You don't want to have things like those various cameras up there where, that's just a simple example, but it's just one to illustrate how easy it is for people to get this sort of information. Back in 2003, 2002-ish, I had a conversation within our own organization that I was working at, and I said, you know what would be a great idea? If we lock down all the laptops and desktops and servers and make them all Bastion hosts, and then we don't have to worry about when they ended up in the wrong network and things like that. And then I escaped that meeting with my life, which was fantastic, because the support team that would have had to deal with it was there. They weren't very happy with me, oddly enough. But here we are, 2019, and now we're having a really good, productive conversation about it. Because the way we used to do things in a lot of the organizations was that they would lock down everything in the DMZ. They would make sure everything internet-facing was secure. But systems on the inside were imminently vulnerable. In one company I worked at, they had installed entire Microsoft Office suites on all of the production Windows servers. Why? Well, we had a license for it. So they thought it was a good idea to put this on production servers, but you know what? Okay. So as we're going through and we're talking about how are we going to get to the zero trust, how are we going to start locking things down, you want to make sure that you're setting your expectations within your own organization. Don't say, oh, I want to get zero trust certified. Doesn't exist. It is an iterative process. It is something to aspire to. And you want to make sure that every time you're doing something that you're trying to get to a better place than you were before. Because a lot of this goes back to dealing with core fundamentals. Even something as simple as looking at your log files. Not many companies do that, which is really jarring when you think about it. It is a game of increments where every little bit is a win, and you have to celebrate those wins. But before you get into celebrating the wins, you want to determine what those priorities are within your organization. What is it you're trying to achieve? Before you ever talk to any vendor out there, you want to make sure you do your homework, bless you. You want to make sure that you understand what it is you need for your environment, because it's going to be bespoke. It is not going to be a one-size-fits-all for every company. Like a vulnerability scanner company comes in and says, oh, your ratings are high, medium, and low. That means nothing to you in your particular organization. You need to tailor it accordingly. You want to be able to deal with attacks in a way that you understand how to beat them. So if a credential dump happens, and you don't know about it for several weeks, and the attackers are using these credentials to get into your company, how do you know? It looks like legitimate traffic. So if you're using multi-factor authentication as an example, the attacker won't be able to use those credential dumps because they only have part of the equation. They only have the username and the password. They don't have the third factor. They don't have the device that is in your inventory that is registered. You want to make sure that you verify your users in your environment, verify your devices, and protect every application that you're using. You don't want to have somebody that is sitting in a coffee shop in London accessing your resources on your email accounts when they're not one of your company staff. You don't want some pesky Canadian coming in and causing trouble. It's really simple. You take the user, you go against your source of truth, say Active Directory is an example, check in the device inventory, yep, that's great, then ignore the vendor-y stuff. Verify all of that, and then you can get access to everything here. It's really simple. All of these controls are all parts of elements that have always existed. You want to make sure you're going through and looking at the trusted users in your environment. Who are they? In one company that I worked at, we did an audit of all of our users, and we found that there were about 10 to 20 users that had super user privileges or better. Well, not better, but super user privileges. Plus. But of them, 10 of them no longer worked at the company. One of them had passed away 5 years previous, and that person's account had been accessed 3 years previous, or 2 years previous. So somehow, a deceased individual was accessing the network. The only reason we knew is because we had gone back and done an audit. There should have been removed. There should have been better access controls, better staff add remove processes. And processes are really a great thing that you guys can do in your own environment that will help you a great deal. When the attackers get that information, they have to have all of these individual components in order to break into your network. If you have trusted devices, you already have that asset inventory. You know what you are expecting to try to come knocking into your company. If you were one of Jason Bourne's colleagues trying to break into a system with something that was left behind on a job, at least you have that in your asset inventory and it was marked as destroyed, but there it is, something's very wrong. And when you're traveling, this is one of those things that can really bite you, in my case in particular. So if you're doing a proper type of implementation, you're looking at it, you're making sure that all the devices that are trying to access your network are patched to current or N-1. You can now enforce that using these sort of technologies. This has bitten me because I was on the road at one point and I tried to log in and said, your browser's out of date, you got to update it before you jump in. And I'm like, oh, great, fantastic. Hoisted on my own petard. But this is really a good way to help interacting with the user, helping enforcing a good security idea with your users to make sure that they understand that as well, because if they are educated, they will help as part of the greater scheme. You want to make sure those devices are up to date. Every application that you're using in your environment, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's a third-party email, whatever it happens to be, you want to be able to marshal access to those things. And you want to have the ability to get granular to allow access depending on what it is you need to do. So I actually rolled out multi-factor authentication on my own website, liquidmatrix.org, for our users. There's about 10 of us. And there's one user that I like to mess with because he'll end up in certain countries on travel, and I will disable his access just because I'm a jerk. But that's just it. You can get super granular as to what they can and can't do, or allow his browser to access, but he can't do certain things because, well, apparently I have nothing better to do. Beyond Corp is a great example here. The Google implementation, the whole idea here is you're leveraging stuff you already have in your environment. You already have network zones. You already have VPNs. You already have asset inventories, or at least I really hope you do. I've been in organizations that had none. That was fun. You want to look at it as here's a shopping list. The simplest way to get started dealing zero trust is build your asset inventory in whatever way works best for you. You want to look at your user management. You want to manage your devices. Now this here, like I mentioned earlier with processes, a defined repeatable process is something that can absolutely help you, and it's something you can do yourselves. I worked at a power company years ago where the CIO decided this year there's going to be no net new projects. Everything is just going to be maintained. That's it. And we rolled out ITIL in that year. As painful as that sounds, it actually worked out really well. In our first year, our rate of incidents dropped 72% because we were using defined repeatable processes. And once you have all of these pieces in place, you can start watching for user behavior and analytics to see what is actually going on, and you can analyze that data and pulling it into whatever SIM solution you happen to be using. And this here is my favorite of all time, network zone segmentation. I worked at one financial institution years ago where I was able to sit at my desktop in Toronto and query the mainframe and do all sorts of things, and then I felt guilty and I went to tell them about it and I said, look, I'm sorry, I was trying to gain access to the mainframe because I thought it was a good idea. I didn't ask permission first. They went, oh, we didn't know. They had no logging. There was no connection between the back office and the mainframe that would have stopped me. Or no control, rather. This is not the way to do things. So once you have started locking down your users, once you have started controlling the assets and the applications they're accessing, the attackers are going to get frustrated and they're going to start going after your APIs. And you start to have focusing on that to make sure that things are going according to plan. Twitter, back in the day when they had first rolled out their API, it was really interesting. A friend of mine, Robert Hanson, he started going through and adding all sorts of people on Twitter. And all of a sudden, we were all following him and we're like, wait, how did this happen? We didn't even know. So he found undocumented features in the API where he was able to arbitrarily add anybody he wanted. And it was really amazing. But that sort of thing can happen with your APIs today. If you have undocumented features, somebody smarter than me is going to find them. And when we're dealing with that, then we have to extrapolate out and look at the supply chain issues. This is just one example here. This is a submarine cable map for internet connections around the world. Then you extrapolate out from there all the different software packages that you're using to build your applications, to build your infrastructure. Each piece along the way, somebody has access to. How are you vetting the security of all of those individual components? How are you making sure who has access to what? And the attackers are always looking for new ways to get in, because back in the day, they would just go after and attack the site. In my last job, I was asked, how would I hack the company? And I said, this was during my interview process, and I said, simple. I would take the CEO's admin out for lunch. I said, what would that accomplish? And I said, well, I'd either talk her into giving me my password, or I'd use a brick to her fingers. Dark, but this is how the attackers think. They're not going to come at you with a frontal assault anymore. They're going to look for another way around, an easier way to get their job done. I had a pen test done years ago. Not too many years ago, actually. Oh my God, 11 years ago. Wow. And again, this was one of those moments where I came in the morning, sat down with my coffee, and the phone rang, and they said, we're ready to start. It was 9 a.m. I was like, sure, go for it. 9:14, the phone rang. I just stared at the phone because I knew in my heart what that was. I didn't want to answer it, but I did. And sure enough, the pen test team had gained access to every switch, every router, the entire Active Directory. They had everything in 14 minutes. Why? Because one of our third-party connections coming into our network, one of our vendors that we worked with, had used default credentials on their access point. This was one of those things where I didn't say the pen test, you can only attack between 5 and 6 on this day and only these 2 servers. I said, no, anything's fair game. Oop. And I paid for that rather dearly. But I'm glad they did it and not somebody else. The best part was they went through and they checked all the logs and access files for everything they had done, and they could actually find no evidence of anybody else coming in. So that was a nice little moment, assuming that the logs were intact. So as we go through and we look back at all the ports that were open in Sweden as an example, one of the things that I went through and looked at was SSH. So this is just one sample that I went through, and I looked and I said, okay, well, what kind of things is this particular SSH daemon vulnerable to? And this is one I just picked at random. That's a lot of vulnerabilities for one daemon. So if somebody could gain access to this system, then pivot to other systems, the pain can just go from there. That's a lot of SSH daemons that are running out there in Sweden. You want to make sure that you're encrypting everything in your network. When you're looking at this, you want to look at network traffic in flight. You want to look at data at rest. You want to make sure that you're securing this. I've seen too many implementations in organizations over the years where they weren't encrypting the data. One company in particular was doing financial transaction data, like not actual bank, but it was a company that was supplying all sorts of data. Very cool. That was a new one. And they were providing financial data to us, and they said, oh, it's okay, everything's over port 443. And I looked, and I said, but there's no certificate. I said, no, but the requirements are we're supposed to use 443. And it's like, none of the data that they were going across was actually, in fact, encrypted, but they were using the port. There's a better way to do things. We can move away from doing the static usernames and passwords. And this is a great way for us to get there. How many people here, by a show of hands, have heard of WebAuthn? Damn, you guys are impressive. That's more than I expected. Thank you. This is an open standard that was recently ratified by W3C. Please go and read this. If you take nothing else away from my talk today, read this. This is an open standard. This is not some vendor saying, buy our stuff. This is an open standard that will help you get to passwordless authentication. This is the new hotness. And I would really, really enjoy it if we can do better than the static usernames and passwords that we have done for far too long. So let's do a little wrap up. You want to assume that your network is hostile. Everything on your network is of some negative bent. If you start there as your basis, then you got a good place to go. You want to establish a trust engine. You want to make sure that you have your source of truth for your users, your devices, and the applications that you're using. And right down, you want to keep it simple. I'm a big fan of repetition. Build your asset inventory. Have solid grasp on your user management. You want to know what is on your network. Defined, repeatable processes will help you in ways that you can't imagine. Concentrate on those. That's not something you have to buy from anybody. This is something you can do yourselves. And network zone segmentation, please, please, please do this. I worked in one organization, which I may have mentioned before, where I was in Toronto and I was able to query offices in Southeast Asia, and there was no way for anything to be a problem. No interactions that would stop me from that. It was a flat network, global flat network. This is not something that needs to be there. So how did we get stuck with passwords? Near as we can figure, back in 1962, MIT came out with passwords for a system called CTSS. Now, this was a time management system to handle people's access for supercomputing time. Each student was allowed 4 hours per week computing time in order to do their projects. But people figured out how they could steal time from other students, and so they went, okay, a reactionary measure was to put in passwords. Think about that for a second. In 1962, a reactionary measure was to put passwords. And here we are today, suffering data breaches of orders of magnitude of billions of records because of a reactionary knee-jerk response. We can do better than this. The old way of doing security is fading away. We need to be there to enable the business, enable our organizations, enable our governments to do security in a better way. The old way is fading, and this is a good thing because we need to improve how we do security. We don't need to be lobbing the holy hand grenade of Antioch every time something goes wrong. We don't need to be the group that is saying, how do we get to know? We're better than this. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much to SecurityFest for having me back again. I really, really do appreciate it. And that is it for me. If you have any questions, I'm at your mercy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. That was amazing, as always.
Thank you.
I'm going to have Jesper run around and see if we have any questions in the audience. So please put your hands up if you do.
Okay, I got to ask. I have a question.
Yeah.
What's that guy doing?
He's taking amazing videos.
Oh, okay, cool.
You'll see them on Twitter soon.
Okay. Thank you for a really great talk.
My pleasure.
How do you implement this in the cloud environment with a container technology like Kubernetes? Mm-hmm. As Jesper here has had a really good talk with the difficulties with all the applications that are involved and the inherited vulnerabilities.
Well, yeah, so inherited vulnerabilities, that is a different animal. So there you're looking at dealing with the access control. So you're dealing with the users and the access to the applications. And I don't want to get too much into specifics because then it sounds like I'm vendoring at you, and I don't want to be doing that. But I'm more than willing to have that conversation with you once I'm off the stage because I don't want to seem like that guy. Cool.
Anyone else? Of course there is.
Oh,
all the way in the back.
Is that the Spaniard? Yes. Hey, how are you?
First of all, thanks for a really nice talk.
Thank you.
And I want to ask you if, you have been coming up with a lot of things that can be done. For example, setting up web authn as a way to use biometrics and so, and have different network segmentations. And the question I have is, suppose you just start at a whole new company. Mm-hmm. You suddenly get into the role of CISO, and you have to do first one single thing. If you could only give one advice, because you only had 1 minute, mm-hmm. which thing would you start focusing on?
For the first day for a CISO?
Yes.
Wear Kevlar. Realistically, I would say start with an asset inventory. If you don't know what's on your network, how can you protect it? I've been in far too many organizations over the years where we didn't have a firm understanding as to what the asset inventory was. In one company, we were rolling out a new version of antivirus across the board, and they said, okay, well, here's the inventory of everything we currently have. Once we started doing scans of the network and checking all the assets to see what, in fact, was installed versus what we were told was installed, The two did not even remotely lined up. So it's one of those things, if you have a solid core asset inventory, from there, then you start building out incremental wins. You don't want to try to do everything at once. You can't boil the ocean.
Okay, anyone else? It's early, but hey, you should get the question out there.
And I'm around for the rest of the day. And also, if you want, you feel free to drop me an email, too, if you have a question you don't want to ask.
Sweet.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.